Mr. Cannabis.
As we discussed in section 1.1, photosynthesis requires photons, water, and CO2. Inadequate CO2 supplementation is one of the primary limiting factors for maximizing growth. CO2 levels of 400 ppm to 600 ppm can restrict photosynthesis when your plants are in full bloom with a high enough metabolic rate. But supplementing levels from 800 to 1400 ppm can greatly boost your photosynthetic activity. However, for high CO2 to be effective, a higher environmental temperature is required to maximize photosynthesis. So if your grow room is kept a bit cool, the effect is not as drastic and adding CO2 may not be worth it. If you're able to keep the temperature in your grow room above 85 degrees Fahrenheit during its lighting period, then CO2 can be effectively used by your plants. Of course, it's not just high temp levels, but also high enough PAR levels as well. High-powered grow lights such as HIDs or large LEDs usually supply enough ppfd to make the additional CO2 a viable option. With these lighting systems, if your CO2 levels are too low, some of that light even goes to waste, as your plants won't be able to use it due to the lack of CO2. Of course, CO2 consumption depends on the size and growth phase of the plant. For seedlings or clones, 400 ppm is ideal. During the vegetative phase, 400 to 800 ppm is recommended, and during the flowering phase, 800 to 1400 ppm is often required. For reference, background CO2 levels in the environment is 400 ppm, while spaces occupied by people with adequate ventilation will have CO2 levels around 400 to 1000 ppm. This is why I always try an intake from a location where people are hanging out, like I do with my current grow room that pulls in from my smoking room, which people are in and out of all day. Of course, it's not just ppfd, temperature and humidity, size, and growth phase that need to be considered. The media that you're growing in also has a significant impact on how much CO2 your plants will be consuming. Growing in soil or low porosity peat or cocoa will only allow your plants to have a certain metabolic or growth rate. Whereas high porosity peat or cocoa, or really any hydroponic system like rockwool, deep water culture, or aeroponics, will produce significantly higher growth rates, meaning higher CO2 consumption. But we'll go more into the differences of those media in Module 5, Growing Mediums. But basically what you need to take away from all this is if you're a new grower with a low-end to moderate setup, you can probably just focus on proper ventilation, and that should get you enough CO2 for your plants. But if you're running some killer lights in an efficient grow room in high porosity media or hydroponics, you might want to look into boosting your CO2 levels as your next step. CO2 to your canopy can be increased by using a fan to circulate the air from the bottom of your grow room to the canopy, as CO2 is heavier than air and often sinks to the floor. For hobbyists, a yeast or beer fermenter that produces CO2 through fermentation can easily be added and used. Placing CO2 bags in your grow room is also an option. CO2 bags are filled with fungi that produce CO2 as they grow, but multiple CO2 bags are often required for even medium grow tents. Containers of compost could also be used, but has the downsides of having an unpleasant smell and not that much CO2 production. Another option, of course, is a CO2 injector system that uses compressed carbon dioxide and a controlled injector. Although costly, an automated system is often recommended for ease of use. But using compressed CO2 and a controller injector is an advanced option. The CO2 comes in bottles or tanks, and they're hooked up to a controller valve to adjust the amount of CO2 flow. And then of course there's the financial cost of having to constantly refill your CO2 tanks. And you'll also want to time your CO2 injections between your ventilation times, as you don't just want to exhaust money outside. What's not recommended is CO2 generators. Burning fossil fuels or alcohol to produce CO2 is not recommended as it's a fire hazard and can be harmful to the environment and yourself. Special CO2 generators for gardening are still not recommended, as those are made for outside where you have proper ventilation. Adding CO2 during your dark period is not necessary, as there's no photosynthetic activity. You can save money by turning off CO2 enrichment about an hour or so before the lights go out. It's also a good idea to seal your grow room as much as possible to prevent CO2 from leaking out, especially on the bottom half of your grow room, as again, CO2 is heavier than air and will sink down. When CO2 is dissolved in the water, it forms carbonic acid, which can lead to a decrease in the pH of your water. But don't worry, we'll cover more about pH in section 6.1, pH. But the important part is when you're using air pumps and stones to aerate your solution, you're pulling in gases from the environment and putting them into your solution. This can be a big mistake if your pump is located in a grow space that's receiving supplemental CO2. But the amount of CO2 required to lower the pH of water by a specific amount depends on the buffering capacity of the water. Water with a low buffering capacity can experience a much more significant pH change with a smaller amount of CO2 compared to water with a high buffering capacity. But we'll go more into the buffering capacity of water in section 6.2, alkalinity. But my point is, if you're using an air pump and supplemental CO2, place your pump outside the grow room and run the lines to where you need them. Now, that will decrease the pressure that ultimately reaches your stones, but better that than running a lower pH than you desire. High CO2 levels are dangerous to humans, and the effects range from drowsiness to death. So avoid breathing air with high CO2 levels of 1500 ppm or more for long periods of time. So minimize the time in your grow room when CO2 enrichment is active, and seal off your grow room to the exterior location if you spend a lot of time in there like I do. Alright, so now that we've covered the environmental factors that can influence your plants, let's move on to what else is influenced by those same factors and something us growers have all had to combat.
Pathogens.